Hello and welcome to Joe and Kat Chats. Oh my goodness. Today we're talking about Black Wall Street 100 years later. We are recording this live on June 1st, 2021 on Facebook and YouTube at /JoeNiceDJ. Find us on all socials at Joe and Kat Chats or on our personal pages at JoeNiceDJ and at CatWells22. And we are also happy to be a part of Tastemakers Radio on Dash Radio. So listen every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. We have a lot to talk about today, Joe. But first, how are you?
You know what?
What have you been thinking about?
You know what? I am as good as I've ever been, and I promise you that. Today has been an interesting day. I received a racist hate email this morning. I'm not going to discuss the contents of the email. You all can see what that looks like on my Instagram story today, or on my quite honestly on both of my Facebook accounts, or on my Instagram feed. You can see it. I censored it because there's some language that doesn't need to be in the public sphere. Additionally, I don't want to be the one censored for reposting an email where somebody else used violent language. So I'm going to make sure that I play this game right, because this whole fourth and fifth estate is a game. And, in the words of Rick Astley, you know the rules and we're going to play it. Okay. So that's what it is right now. And that's where I am with all of this. People are like, Joe, are you okay? Are you all right? What's going on? Is everything all right? I've never been better. The reason why I've never been better is because I'm perfectly fine with racists exposing themselves. I'm perfectly fine with a bigot typing a racist email to me and removing all doubt about that person's ideology. I'm perfectly good with that. The problem I have is the covert or undercover racists that smile in your face and stab you in the back. Those are people I have a problem with. The people who are overt with their bigotry and prejudice and racism and hate, okay, good. Now I know who you are, and I can deal with you accordingly.
Right.
It's the people who, it's the wolves in sheep's clothing that's the issue. They are the problem. And this is the entire reason why you and I, my dear sister, have been able to do exactly what we've been doing for now 52 weeks, but really 51 episodes, because we doubled up on one of the episodes earlier this year, or actually earlier last year. But be that as it may, it is what it is. I'm looking forward to an absolutely robust discussion today, because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot on both of our minds, in our souls and in our hearts. There's a lot that people are feeling, and somehow, and I'm not sure why, but I'm happy to acknowledge this, somehow we have been ordained, appointed, selected, chosen, etc. It seems like we are some of the voices of the people. We are the people, you and I specifically, where people can come watch us, people can listen to us, and they don't feel inadequate. They don't feel as if, oh, wow, you know what? I feel like I'm on this deserted island by myself. You know what? There are other people that think like me. There are other people that feel like me. There are other people that understand what's going on in my mind, but I don't necessarily know how to say what I'm feeling, or I'm too shy to say what I'm feeling publicly. So inexplicably, we have something here that's incredibly special, because we somehow have this strange mix of being able to be academic and be information rich, yet being emotionally and socially conscious, and still while remaining topical and relevant to everyone that is willing to dissect and absorb what we offer on a week-to-week basis. So again, I couldn't have asked anyone else that I would rather be with right now than you to talk about the stuff we're going to talk about. And I'm thankful for all of the viewers that continue to support us, whether it's a direct message, an email, or tweet, or retweet, whatever it is. So, and again, we have a lot to talk about, because today is the centennial of the Black Wall Street Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We also want to spend some time discussing the 215 indigenous children that were found in a mass grave outside of an indigenous school in Kamloops, British Columbia. You are in British Columbia. So Obviously, you're going to have a bit more expertise with respect to the Indigenous situation than I would, because you're in Canada and you studied this a bit more than I have. That being said, we have a lot to talk about. I've opined for the past 5 minutes and 19 or 20 seconds. How are you, Miss Wells?
Yeah, I'm doing well, as well as I can be. And yes, thank you for saying all of that.
You're
I
welcome.
truly hope that that is the experience of everyone that does come across or watch regularly our podcast or whatever this is. Yeah, I mean, our goal is to bring the knowledge that we have gained over the years and make it accessible. And so I really hope that that is the case. Yeah, I wanted to just kind of encourage everyone who watches or listens to this to send some love to Joe Nice, because we can quadruple or empteen tuple the love, because receiving an email like that has got to be friggin' awful. If you're interested, Joe has posted on his Instagram, and so yeah, I just wanted to encourage everyone to send you some love today.
You know what? You know what, Kat? You know what? And I appreciate that. Thank you. But quite honestly, I'm not necessarily looking for that. Okay, I'm not looking for that.
Yeah.
Okay, what I'm looking for is the whole ethos of this show. What I'm looking for is to make sure that people understand that racism, bigotry, prejudice, it's real, it's tangible. Okay, it could happen to anyone. It could happen to you, and you are a white woman. It could happen to you. Some nut job in Canada could be like, oh, I don't like Cat Wells because he's talking to this black guy every week. That could easily take place. So the love that I'm looking for, it's not for me, it's for everyone else. Because that we've spoken about Marvin Gaye. We've spoken about Marvin Gaye several times. Okay? And there's a quote from the line of from the song What's Going On, where Marvin Gaye sings, "War is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate."
Mm-hmm.
War is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate. Okay? And last week we talked about what does love look like in 2021. We talked about that with our dear sister, Rue Johnson. We talked about that.
Yeah.
What does love look like? Love, and I've said this plenty of times, love sometimes comes in the form of having difficult and uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
Love sometimes comes in the form of presenting emails to the world to see that hate still exists in our society.
Yeah, for sure.
Love sometimes comes in the form of having difficult conversations so everybody can benefit from it. Love sometimes comes in the form of, like I said about a month ago, either calling someone in or calling someone out. Thank you, Ansel Adolphus Anderson. Okay? So that is what love looks like. So I've been giving that for the better part of 45 years now.
Yeah.
It's not about me. It's not about me. Because if I make this about me, then the message gets lost. The message is far more important than me. The message that I want people to understand is there are hateful people out here. Be careful of them. Recognize them. See who they are. Deal with them accordingly. That is the message. It's not about love for me or, hey, Joe, I'm sorry this happened. Because the people that are saying I'm sorry that it's happened, it's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. But I appreciate the sentiments that everybody is sending my way, and because that has value. But in my opinion, what is more valuable is looking at what that person typed in that email, seeing people that might be in your life. They could be in your workplace. They could be at your civic group. They could be in your church. They could be in bed next to you.
Yeah.
And recognizing, oh, you know what? Wow, I have to deal with this person on a day-to-day basis. Or I don't have to deal with this person on a day-to-day basis because I don't want to associate myself with them. That is what I want people to take away from that email.
Yeah,
It's not about, oh, yo, sorry this happened. Okay. Hey, it happened. Life happens. But
totally.
life is about making sure that we learn from events that take place. This is an event. This is a teachable moment. We move onward and upward.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for saying all of that as well. And I totally agree. Um, I just also wanted to just acknowledge that it's June, it's Pride Month, so happy Pride, everybody. We're not going to talk about that this week. We are planning to talk about Pride next week. So if you're waiting for that, it's coming. I know we've mentioned before that we were gonna do something for Pride, but I think you're totally right in that we need to acknowledge what's gone on in the last week, and we need to talk about the 100-year anniversary of the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's just, it's so important to realize that 100 years ago is not that far away.
No.
It's also important to realize that the residential schools are much closer history, and I say that loosely. It's a much closer history because the last one closed in my home province of Alberta in 1996. I was a child. I could have attended one had I been born an Indigenous person in Alberta. 215 Indigenous children were found in a mass grave at the Kamloops Residential School last week. It was announced or publicized. The deaths of these children and the mass grave were never documented by school administrators. I would not be surprised if this was a very common practice for many of the residential schools across the nation. I've talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission before, and in that report that came out in 2015, it calls residential schools, quote, a systematic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer exist as distinct peoples, end quote. And that's absolutely true. Once you start learning about history, because I will say, everyone I know that went to school here in Canada did not learn about residential schools in like K to 12 school. I didn't learn about it until I was in university, or talking to my friends who were attending university at the time before I actually attended. These residential schools were made compulsory for treaty status children ages 7 to 15 through the Indian Act, which I think came out in 1920. They were notoriously underfunded, overcrowded, and all accounts say that children were severely mistreated, degraded, and abused. All suffered severe abuse, whether it physical, emotional, and or sexual abuse. There was a 40 to 60% mortality rate. So when we tell you that 150,000 children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in residential schools over the course of around 150 years, and the official accounts say that there were only about 6,000 children that died. I mean, there's no way. 40 to 60% mortality rate means that at least 75,000 children are probably, placed in mass graves across the country. So Canada is in mourning for those who know about this and have a conscience. Our government has not acknowledged or said anything of value or substance or any kind of, they've done nothing. They've done nothing in response to this. And I will say, just to kind of finish off the information I wanted to share about this, is that this is not gone. It's not history. Again, the last residential school closed in 1996. I mean, many of us were alive and thriving then. And Canada actually continues to separate Indigenous children from their families through the child welfare or foster care system, where Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented. So the residential schools are not history. They shifted what it looks like. And it basically, I mean, I liken it to the privatization of the residential schools, because what happened is it took, it appears different because they took the power away from the Catholic Church and the government and gave it to private households who are now causing violence towards these Indigenous people who are children, who are overrepresented in the child welfare foster care system. One last thing is most of this information is from the report that On Canada Project provided. So many of you have probably seen some of that on Instagram this week.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I've also been doing my homework, research, knowledge acquisition, etc. There are 140 of these schools across Canada. 140 of them. If one school in Kamloops, British Columbia, and I've been to Kamloops, British Columbia, not exactly the cradle of civilization, let's put it that way. It's a decent sized city, but it's not Winnipeg, it's not Calgary, it's not Vancouver, Toronto, Halifax, Toronto, Ottawa. It's not a big place. Okay, it's I guess that's second tier city in Canada, and 215 bodies were found in that one residential school. This isn't considering, the other 139 schools that have been closed. This is not discussing internment camps. This is not discussing detention centers.
Yeah.
This is just residential schools, 140 of them. Yesterday before my workout, I went Instagram live and I talked for the better part of over 40 minutes when I really meant to talk for about 4 minutes. And this is, and I said this on Twitter and I said this on Facebook the other day. 3 years ago, 15 hockey players, 10 junior hockey players and 5 members of their staff crashed into a tractor trailer and Canada was in mourning. 215 bodies, unidentified bodies, were found at a residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, and half of Canada's like, okay, no big deal, no sweat. I need to know from Canada, what's more important, hockey night in Canada or human lives? I need to know. I really need to know. The world needs to know. And this is something that I said yesterday. I not only am calling for reparations for the descendants of these 215 people, human beings, because that is who they are. They are human beings. These are human lives. I not only want reparations for them, the global community, the world community, because over the past 14 to 21 days, the conversation that has been prevalent has been boycott, divest, and sanction Israel against the human rights violations that Palestinians are suffering from. If we are going to be consistent with our line of thinking, if we are going to be not only righteous, but if, again, we are going to make sure that everything is equal, because you know me, Kat, I am all about humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. If we are about equality, then why isn't the global community saying anything about the human rights violations of Indigenous people, especially these 215 children that were found dead in Canada? Where is the outrage? Where is Boris Johnson? Where is Angela Merkel? Why isn't Emmanuel Macron not saying anything? Where is Joe Biden? But no, Joe Biden can't say anything. Why can he not say anything? Because we have human rights violations taking place in the United States. And because if
Right
we have
here.
because if we acknowledge that we have human rights violations taking place on a day-to-day basis in the United States, then and I shouldn't be using this phrase, but I will, that will be the pot calling the kettle black.
Yeah, and to ground this point even further, I want to kind of flip that around what you just said and say, like, the reason why Canada and the US can't acknowledge the role that Israel plays in the genocide of Palestinian peoples is because we would then, if we acknowledge that, we would then have to acknowledge the colonial state we still exist in today here in Canada and in the United States. And that is exactly what is wrong with this conversation.
Well, not our conversation. Not our conversation.
No, I mean the conversation that's been going on over the past several weeks. Absolutely. Since the massacre that happened a couple weeks ago in Israel, in Gaza, in Palestine in general, what's been ongoing.
Yes.
And honestly, like this, talking about Indigenous issues in Canada is something I don't ever stop talking about because it is ongoing genocide. Like, I don't know how else to say it. It's ongoing. It's still happening today, even though everything that, white settlers are taught and the way that many white settlers talk about this issue is framing it in a historical sense, which is exactly what Trudeau did in his tweet this week in response to this horrific discovery.
Additionally, to go along with everything I just said, and thank you for saying everything you just shared, it's been long past time, but I'm going to ask for it, even though I'm not a Canadian. I guess I'm an honorary Canadian because, lived there, hung out, did my thing.
Of course.
Justin Trudeau should resign immediately. Yeah. Immediately. I don't want to say I don't care who occupies whatever important building in Ottawa that is the equivalent of your White House or 10 Downing Street in England, whatever it is. Justin Trudeau should resign immediately, because putting flags at half-mast and dimming lights to honor the victims, the 215 children that were found dead, that's not enough. That's not enough. It's not enough. It's not even a first step. And the more Canada continues to receive neoliberal responses to a human rights and civil rights issue, a genocide. I don't use this word lightly, but I will use it because it is appropriate. A Holocaust, because that is what happened. And we've only seen one school of 140. There should, if we're going to have, and I said this the other day, what good is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when we're not getting truth nor reconciliation?
Yeah.
If Justin Trudeau was serious about truth and reconciliation, there would be investigations at all 140 schools immediately. In fact, and immediately is not soon enough, because it should have already happened.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, 1996, I was the ripe old age of 20 years old. I was a sophomore in undergrad. 1996 is not that long ago. It's not. So when people say, oh, this is history, history must be taken into context. Now, granted, Canada is significantly younger than the United States as a country. Canada is, 152, 153 years old? And the United States is 345 years old next month, July 4th. My point in this is Canada has a much shorter history of being a country than the United States. But that doesn't mean that history should be whitewashed. That doesn't mean that history should be forgotten. And that doesn't mean that history you can just speed up the clock on history. It doesn't work that way. History is time. Time is the one resource you can't get back. And part of the discussion that we're going to have specifically about the Black Wall Street and reparations is because these sites have already been closed. So you can't go back and apologize to the people who were affected because they are dead. I'm going to say that again for everybody that's misunderstood that. You cannot apologize to the people who were affected or the aggrieved. Why? Because they are dead. So, and I think this probably might be a good time to kind of ease into what we're going to talk about here, but I want to talk about reparations for a couple of minutes, okay? Because how will Canada make amends for this situation? Is the next school, are they going to fly flags at the next time and have staff the next time they find a couple of hundred bodies there? And how much do you want to bet there are more bodies at that particular site? They didn't investigate the whole area.
No.
There are unmarked graves all over the place. So, reparations. This is important, okay? Reparations is the act of making amends. It's an act of fixing a right. It's paying someone who's been disenfranchised or someone who has been wronged. Now, you and I have done 2 episodes specifically about reparations. We did one in the early days of the greatest podcast in the history of podcasts, Joe and Cat Chats, and we did another episode. It was episode 13. That's how important we decided to focus on reparations. Of the first 13 episodes, 2 of them focused on reparations. Now, reparations from the book From Here to Equality by Dr. Sandy Darity. It's a magnificent book that discusses reparations for American descendants of enslaved Africans. And he came up with this framework for pursuing reparations called ARC. ARC stands for Acknowledgement, Redress, Closure. Acknowledgement. Yep, something happened here and we need to fix it. It's the very definition of acknowledgement. Redress. Redress is to make a situation right, having a specific remedy to make a situation right. And you can either apologize or you can compensate for a particular grievance. Now, redress has 2 pathways. And I want to make sure everybody understands what we're going to talk about here. Redress has 2 pathways. You can atone or you can offer restitution. Atonement comes from fixing a sin or immoral wrong. So, atonement, I'm sorry. I really messed up. I did something wrong here. Can you accept my apology? Will you forgive me? Restitution is a legal framework for indemnification or repayment from an injury or a loss. A legal framework. Now, I've said about 15 minutes ago that Canada cannot atone for this human rights crisis. Why? Because the 215 children are dead and 150,000 other children are now dead. And God knows how many others that we will never know because we can't find the unmarked graves, or we'll never know where those other bodies have been buried. So the Canadian government cannot go ahead and say, Indigenous people, we're sorry. We're going to atone for our sins. Can't do it. That ship sailed. So what do? It's restitution. Restitution. And again, I said it's from a legal framework. Okay? Taking children from their parents is illegal. That is kidnapping. Abusing children while they're in the care, custody, and control of teachers hired by the Canadian government, that is physical abuse. That is assault. That is rape. That is sexual assault. That is physical abuse, mental abuse. That is torture. That is a human rights violation. There is a legal framework. Restitution is the only path forward in terms of reparations for everybody that has been affected by this. The C in the acronym of ARC stands for closure. Closure. Closure happens when you reach a resolution. It's when the aggrieved party and the party that is responsible reach an agreement. They reach some sort of binding agreement, and everybody goes about their business and lives their lives, hopefully, while focusing on humanity, freedom, equality, and survival. ARC, acknowledgement, redress, closure. If Justin Trudeau had a spine, He will be reaching out to every single First Nations community now. He will go ahead and institute investigations on every single church, school, church, government building that was involved with illegally taking Indigenous children from their parents. He would dig up every blade of grass. He would leave no stone unturned. Mm-hmm. They would issue a formal apology, and then he would meet with First Nations officials, leaders across the country, and you got a really big country.
Yeah.
And he would resolve this situation as soon as possible. And again, I've said this before, and I will continue to say this again. We must continue to internationalize the struggle. So the pressure must not only be internal. The pressure for Canada to do the right thing by its First Nations community must also be external pressure. And if it comes to a point where other countries must boycott, divest, and sanction Canada, then so be it. If Labatt's beer and maple syrup don't get sold in Germany, oh well. If Canadian lumber doesn't get exported to New Zealand and Australia, damn. If I can't buy a pair of Roots clothing, Roots sweatpants anymore, because hey, we BDS, we boycott, divested, and sanctioned Canada. Okay, because you know what? I value human lives more than a pair of Roots sweatpants. And I think other people across the world should think about that in that context and act accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I think part of the redress conversation also needs to be not only everything you said, which is absolutely true. Trudeau needs to be addressing the atrocities that have gone on. But we also need to address the folks that did survive and are now living in Canada with the trauma and the generational trauma, because this went on for 150 years. That's like 7 generations of people that experienced this horrible abuse through the residential school system. The ongoing colonial genocide includes things like, Aboriginal reserves and Indigenous reserves not having access to clean water. And Canada has a lot of fresh, clean water. So there's reasons why. We've talked about this before. So look into it if you are not familiar with that.
One quick thing I want to share with you, Kat.
Sure.
Okay, because again, I think this is also important in the discussion. Then we will go ahead and begin the discussion about the Black Wall Street massacre that took place 100 years ago. In one of the previous episodes, in the reparations episode, I mentioned CARICOM, and it's the Caribbean Community of Nations, started in Trinidad, and and I have quite the affinity for Trinidad, and it's now headquartered in Guyana. And on the website, CARICOMreparations.org, there is a 10-point plan that began in 2013. I want to read all 10 points to everybody, because if Justin Trudeau needs help figuring out what to do, go to this website. Or you can just, Joe and Kat Chats, just watch us while you're on the treadmill. Listen to us. Pay attention. Okay? Here's the 10-point plan on CARICOMreparations.org. Number 1, a full and formal apology. Number 2, repatriation. Number 3, an Indigenous Peoples Development Program. Number 4, cultural institutions, as in creating and preserving cultural institutions. Number 5, public health. Number 6, illiteracy eradication. Number 7, this is specific to CARICOM. It says African Knowledge Program. So how about an Indigenous Knowledge Program? Number 8, psychological rehabilitation. Number 9, technology transfer. And number 10, debt cancellation. That is a 10-point plan from CARICOM for Caribbean nations to pursue reparations for their European colonizers. For example, Trinidad, the country that I have citizenship in and the country of where my parents are from, and quite honestly, my cultural heritage, they were a colony of England until August 31, 1962, which again is not that long. It's not that long ago. Jamaica was a colony of England until 1964.
Yeah.
If I have been steadfast in my support for reparations, and again, you can look on my T-shirt. This is the fill in the blank T-shirt. You go down the blanks, it spells reparations. Okay, and this is not only just reparations for American descendants of enslaved Africans, which I am fully in support of, but it's reparations for indigenous people. It's reparations for Caribbean Americans and Caribbean Canadians.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
reparations for any country that was colonized, that has to deal with a colonizing country whose gross domestic product, human development index, and fragile state scores are significantly better than the countries that they colonized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for outlining that. I think that that is a really great, I mean, I'm glad that, you know, we have a refresher, and I think it's also a really great framework to start with, because we can, you know, use this list that's already been outlined and tailor it to our own sort of geographic and, you know, global circumstance here, there, wherever we need to, because yeah, I mean, you know, the reparations should look different, you know, depending on who is asking or who is receiving and what they're asking for, I should say. And speaking of reparations, I think that Tulsa is a really interesting example, because we've talked about, you know, white supremacy, you know, various racial justice issues for, I mean, a whole year now. And I found a quote from the current mayor of Tulsa, and he said, quote, "Reparations, it means different things to different people." And then he went on to say, "It would necessarily have to come from a tax levied on this generation of Tulsans. And the idea of financially penalizing this generation of Tulsans for something criminals did 100 years ago, that's a hard thing to ask," end quote. His name is G.T. Bynum, current mayor of Tulsa. Yeah. And I think that this quote is really important, because this is exactly how many white folks frame racial justice now. They don't think it's important. It's exactly how Justin Trudeau framed, you know, his response on Twitter or whatever social media that was, that he released the statement saying this is a dark history, referring to the 250 children found in Kamloops residential school. He said it was part of our dark history. Like, this is not far away. This is not a history. It is ongoing. And the fact that this mayor of Tulsa said that this is something that criminals did 100 years ago, yeah, well, we're going to find out in the next, you know, 20 minutes that the city of Tulsa armed those white people that massacred the Black folks in Greenwood. Exactly. So, like, this is just bonkers to me that this person is defending, you know, the current generation of Tulsans from paying for reparations, because these people have been benefiting from it for the last 100 years.
Actually, probably a bit more than 100 years, but
for sure more than 100 years. But I say that just because of the anniversary.
Yes, of course, and that mayor needs to resign. He needs to get out. Yeah. Get out. Because if he doesn't understand not only a statute of limitations for crimes, but how the butterfly effect of violence and how it affects people generationally. If he doesn't understand that, he has no business leading a city. He has no business in government. None. And he clearly doesn't understand his history, because he doesn't understand that the United States has made reparations payments before. The United States has done this. The United States in 1971 paid Native Alaskans $1 billion and gave them 44 million acres of land. Okay, money and land. Remember those two things: money, land. In 1985, the United States paid the South Dakota Sioux $105 million in reparations. They paid the Chippewas of Wisconsin $31 million. They paid the Ottawas of Michigan $32 million. In 1990, so 31 years ago, not that long ago, 31 years. In 1990, I was 14 years old. Again, not that long ago. The United States paid Japanese Americans $1.6 billion with a B dollars in reparations. Okay, so where did that money come from? Where did $1.6 billion come from to pay Japanese people? What about these millions of dollars to pay all of these indigenous people in the United States? And this mayor is worried about a potential tax might need to be levied to indemnify the descendants of those who suffered as a result of a race riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Shame on that mayor. Shame on him. And there should be people in the streets demanding his resignation. Yeah. Because clearly, if he doesn't understand that the generational effect of genocide, of terrorism, which is what happened on May 31, 1921, then again, if he doesn't understand his city's history, he has no business being in government. There's no business being in government. None.
Yeah, I agree.
None.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight that because, I mean, it just reveals his sort of right-wing, perspective as well, which is a large perspective, a widely adopted perspective for folks in both our countries. Now, really quickly, I know that, many people, it's really easy to find out what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma from between May 31st and June 1st in 1921.
Correct.
But just really quickly, it started by a report that a Black man had assaulted a white woman in an elevator. And
yes.
I found this quote on NPR, which I thought was telling. It said, quote, "The murky incident got blown out of proportion by inflammatory newspaper accounts," end quote. Now, I wanted to highlight that also because it sounds kind of weirdly familiar that maybe the media blowing certain things out of proportion and causing, racial fighting between like division, I guess, racial division. So
additionally, additionally, with respect to that, it's also and we've talked about this in the Karens and white fragility episode. Again, it is also white women weaponizing their whiteness against Black people.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for saying that as well.
This is because the situation between Dick Rowland, who was the 19-year-old kid, and the white lady named Sarah Page, who was an elevator operator in the Drexel building in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is not that much different than Emmett Till. This is quite honestly not that much different than what happened 53 weeks ago almost to the day. If you remember Amy Cooper, Central Park Amy, threatening Christian Cooper and saying that she was assaulting him, and that was on videotape, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And if you remember what happened on that date, May 25, what happened 6 hours later? In Minneapolis, Minnesota, George Floyd was killed. George Floyd was killed. Same day that Amy Cooper threatened Christian Cooper. Same day. We'll continue on. There was an angry white mob wanted to see Dick Rowland lynched. 75 Black people showed up with guns. And the last thing white America wants to see is Black people with guns. Because the Second Amendment doesn't necessarily apply to Black people. They made sure he wasn't lynched. Somebody in the crowd fired a shot. 12 people were killed, 10 white, 2 Black. Word spread about the massacre across the city, and white people began destroying Black-owned businesses. They began killing Black people, looting stores, and committing arson. In addition, the white mob attacked Black people and Black businesses on the ground and with the help of private aircraft, dropping bombs and other types of incendiary devices on Black-owned businesses in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I want everybody to really understand what I'm going to say next. And again, I'm in North Carolina. North Carolina was first in flight. The airplane was invented in North Carolina on December 17, 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Somehow, within less than 20 years, private aircraft was used to drop bombs on residential neighborhoods and businesses in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma. A week ago, you and I discussed Operation Move in Philadelphia that took place in May of 1985. Same situation took place. The Philadelphia Police Department launched bombs into the middle of that neighborhood on Osage Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, destroyed 60 homes, killed a bunch of people, and rendered a bunch of other people homeless. Now, 35 square blocks of that neighborhood were damaged. Over 10,000 Black people were left homeless. 1,200 homes were damaged. 800 Black people were hospitalized. And according to reports, 300 people were dead. There's no way to know how many people were actually dead. Why? Because guess what? There were mass graves. A bunch of other Black people burned in the fires that were set from the bombs that were dropped on the buildings. And any other dead people that were found after the fires were extinguished were thrown into the Arkansas River. In addition, the white mob received help from not only the Ku Klux Klan, but the Blue Klux Klan, the police officers. So the history of this situation was not discussed for over 50 years on a local, state, or national level. Now, why did Black Wall Street exist? Why? Number one, there's a big oil industry in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, Black people weren't allowed to work on the oil fields, but they were working for many of the white wealthy people in that particular area. Number two, again, as I just said a couple of seconds ago, a lot of the Black people ended up working for wealthy white folks, and the money was good. It was oil. Number three, the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma had Black doctors, they had Black lawyers, Black teachers. They had all of the major institutions for a thriving community. And for those of you who are historians of the Joe and Kat Chat series, you will know that the four institutions that every thriving community must have are a bank, a school, a hospital, and a grocery store. Once again, a bank, a hospital, a school, and a grocery store. In addition, this community, the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, also had hotels. They also had pharmacies. They're important. Number four is Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's plenty of land available, wide and spread out, plenty of space. There's plenty of space. Number five, Tulsa, Oklahoma was a place to get away from the segregated South when Jim Crow laws were the prevailing law of the land in the segregated South. Number six, before a lot of Black people ended up moving to the area that was called Oklahoma, before it became a state. Oklahoma did not become a state until 1907. 1907. Now, what was the aftermath? Because this is important. Again, we got about 10 or 11 minutes left. What was the aftermath to all of this? Number one, all these businesses were destroyed. No reparations have been paid. No sorts of restitution at all. The only building that survived was a high school. And that high school, the Red Cross ended up taking over that building for all of the injured and or dead as a result of this massacre. Number two, Black people didn't have the capital to rebuild because all of their capital was in their businesses. Number three, I want to make sure everybody understands what I'm going to say next. Number three, shortly after the massacre took place and all the fire was extinguished and all of the debris was cleaned up, Tulsa, Oklahoma passed an ordinance stating that only brick was allowed to be used for any rebuilding of those areas. I'm going to say that again. Tulsa, Oklahoma passed a city ordinance stating that only brick was allowed to be used for the rebuild of the buildings that were damaged as a result of the fires. Here's why that was damaging. Number one, brick was cost prohibitive. Guess who was excluded from buying brick? Black people. That also excluded a whole lot of Black business owners from rebuilding in that area. Now, this race massacre took place on May 31, 1921. On episode 8 of the Joe and Kat Chat series, we had an entire episode devoted to housing and racism, where we talked about redlining that took place in my beloved hometown of Baltimore on December 17, 1910. It was the first racial covenant ever enforced in the United States, where Black people were only allowed to live where other Black people live, and white people were only allowed to live where other white people live. And because of that, homes in predominantly Black areas were devalued, and homes in white areas appreciated exponentially in value. This situation with a city ordinance only stating that brick was supposed to be used in order for the rebuild is maybe not explicitly redlining, but is a form of implicit redlining, because you are preventing Black people from being able to rebuild in an area that they built with their blood, sweat, tears, and years of labor. That is what happened. So as a result, generations of Black people were not able to rebuild in that area. So now there's no opportunity for generational wealth. And again, you and I have talked about this, the racial wealth gap. We did that in the early days of the Joe and Kat Chat series. We did that months, almost a year ago, we did this. So again, if you want to learn more about what we've talked about with respect to wealth inequality, housing, and racism, and the lasting effects of this particular situation, go ahead and listen to episode number 7. That's the wealth inequality episode. Go ahead and listen to episode 8. That is the housing and racism episode. Additionally, none of the white people that were involved in the race riot faced any sort of prosecution. None of them. And last and most harrowing, many of the victims that were injured or died were buried in unmarked graves across Tulsa, Oklahoma. Across Tulsa, Oklahoma. So when I said about 15 minutes ago that there were 300 reports of 300 people dead, there's no way to know how many people were dead, because again, there are unmarked graves across Tulsa, Oklahoma. And if there was an unmarked grave, there were plenty of other people who were unidentified, or plenty of other Black people who were burned to a crisp as a result of the incendiary devices that were dropped from these airplanes or launched by the Ku Klux Klan or the police, and their bodies were thrown in the Arkansas River. I want to make sure everybody understands that. So when you have a racist mayor that says, oh, we're not going to have people from this generation pay for sins of the past, then who is going to pay for them? Who should be paying for them? Again, I've said this before and I will continue to say this again, and I know I'm talking a lot. Racism is a function of economics. Racism is a function of economics. Why did this happen? Because white people back in those days, yeah, they wanted to see Black people doing well, but they didn't want to see Black people doing better than them. I'm going to say that again. White people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, yeah, they wanted to see Black people doing okay, but they didn't want to see Black people doing better than them. They didn't want that. The reason for this entire race riot is government failure. The government failed these people. Why? Because the government, the federal government, legalized slavery in 1789, but slavery began in 1619. So the institution of slavery is older than the institution of these United States. Number 2, enslaved people did not get paid for their labor at any point. In fact, enslaved people were not allowed to own any property. Why? Because enslaved people were property. I'm going to say that again. Enslaved people were not allowed to own property because enslaved people were property. The 13th Amendment was supposed to free slaves. Hey, everybody's free. And with that, reparations were supposed to be paid in 40 acres and a mule. Never happened. The 14th Amendment of the United States is supposed to offer equal protection under the law. But why did the southern states have Jim Crow laws and convict leasing if everybody was supposed to have equal protection under the law? Again, this goes out to everybody that wants to frame the argument about reparations. Well, why are we giving Black people money? It's not about call for reparations. And I'm going to be crystal clear with what I'm going to say next. The call for reparations, it's not about Black people taking white people's money. That has never been the call for reparations. It is not about Black people taking assets from white people, because that is not the point. The call for reparations is about Black people exercising their First Amendment rights to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. The government is the institution that enforced slavery. The government is the institution that enforced wealth inequality. The government is the institution that enforced racism. The government is the institution that made sure that Black people were considered 3/5 of a human being. The government is the institution that made Black people property instead of human beings. It is not specifically white people's responsibility to pay Black people for reparations. It is the federal government's responsibility to pay reparations to American descendants of enslaved Africans.
Yes, thank you for all of that. That was really, really important, and I'm glad that you were able to outline all of that. And I totally agree. And I can also
one other thing, Kat. This is about making sure that the government does what it is supposed to do, what they say they're supposed to do. Because the government, the reason we have government or governance is because of that unspoken social contract between the government and government leadership and its citizenry, otherwise known as the body politic. We discussed that in the voting episode, the body politic, which is you, the people who live in a particular nation and or state. The first three words of the United States Constitution are "we the people." Who is the government? The government is the people. The government is supposed to pay this debt. Again, reparations is not about Black people taking anything from white folks. That's not what it's about. It is about the government paying a debt that is owed to enslaved Africans of American descent and the people, the descendants of the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I can also sort of relate it back to the issue that we began this episode with, in the sense that the government covered up the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they covered up the residential school genocide, and the people that are responsible are being protected under the law of the government. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to compare the two instances, but I can definitely see, some parallels, I guess, in the two instances that we spoke about today. And really quickly, I just wanted to, in regards to, racism being a function of economics, I just wanted to we don't have time to go over all of the other, examples of Black Wall Streets and racial justice, or I guess massacres really is what they ended up being. I had written down a bunch, of notes for, the Chinese population and the discrimination they have faced, and Mexican folks in the southern states, particularly the southern western states. And there's a common thread in all of these instances of economic, I guess just white people being mad that other races are gaining economic independence. Sorry. So we can talk about this another time. We have to go really soon, and I wanted to thank you sincerely, Joe, for everything today. I want to thank everybody who listened in live and everyone who will be listening to this. Yeah, I mean, there's lots more to be said, but thank you.
Well, take care.